This is a guy whose face you probably don't recognize. But in films, he's the person who's made you go, oh my God, I mean in awe and take your breath away. If you saw Poltergeist.
They're here.
Now Steven Spielberg crosses a frightening new threshold into a world within our own. Its form is revealed.
What is it?
Its focus is clear. And the games are over. Poltergeist. It knows what scares you.
And if you saw Ghostbusters.
Ghosts.
Hello, Ghostbusters.
They're real.
You do? You have?
They're here. Ghostbusters.
Hey, anybody see a ghost?
They catch the ghost that won't stay dead.
If you saw any of the three in the saga, of the Star Wars saga.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
Luke Skywalker and Han Solo rescued the princess, destroyed the Death Star, but their story didn't end there. Now, the creators of the biggest smash hit of all time bring you the next episode in the Star Wars saga, The Empire Strikes Back.
Return for the climactic clash between the forces of good and evil. Return to a galaxy far, far away. Return of the Jedi.
This is the guy who does the special effects. He's the one who, my goodness.
For nearly 3,000 years, man has searched for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. It is protected by forces beyond imagination. It is desired above all treasures on Earth by those who are good, trust me, and those who are evil.
I'll tell you everything. Yes, I know you will.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Let her go.
My name is Richard Edlund, and I'm a visual effects supervisor and a cinematographer, basically.
Hello, this is David from the Followers of the Force podcast. How are you, Richard?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really happy you're able to come on the show today. I really appreciate it. So, first of all, Richard, I mean, you have a storied career in visual effects, and you're responsible for some of my favorite movies, growing up and everything. So, first of all, I just want to talk to you about, how you got inspired to, become involved in the world of filmmaking.
Well, I started out in Japan, actually.
Mm-hmm.
When I was stationed, I was in the Navy, and I got stationed in Japan for 2 years. And one day I discovered a movie camera in the storage room that somebody had ordered. It had never been opened. It was a complete Mitchell professional movie camera system. And so I basically unpacked it, and I found a book in the library, the only book on film. It was called The Grammar of the Film by Raymond Spottiswoode, which was became my Bible. It was basically a treatise on the silent film, which was great because we didn't have any sound equipment. So so anyway, that's how I started shooting aircraft accident reports and things like that before this, and so I basically shot a couple of training films and started working on a documentary that never got finished because I got mustered out of the Navy before we got that far. But in any case, that's where I got started.
Well, that's awesome.
So there was I don't know if you guys, do you hear that already? The gardeners are out in front of the machines. Anyway, quiet down.
Oh, no, you're good.
So there was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian Marine in the photo lab that I was stationed at in Japan. There was about 40 of us in this lab. It was 40. It was called the Fleet Air Photo Lab, and it serviced the 7th Fleet. And so basically, they would fly in. They would fly in with radar material. We had to develop it at night and have it ready for them. But in any case, there was just about every kind of photographic equipment known to man at this lab, and so it was. And I was already a pretty accomplished photographer by the time I got in the Navy.
Right.
And so it all just went along from there. And this jarhead, the Marine, the only Marine in the group, told me, Edlund, you don't want to go to Brooks Institute. You want to go to USC when you get out, because you can study movies there. It's the best cinema school in America.
Right.
I said, well, that sounds really interesting. So I wrote a letter to USC and asked them to send me information on the cinema department, which they did. And so when I got out, shortly after I got out, I enrolled at USC. And anyway, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
But in any case, I spent 2 years at USC and got 3 years of credits. So I did 3 years in 2 with a pretty full load.
Right.
And then I decided, rather than because this was all at night school, because I was working in the morning, studying in the afternoon, then I could take classes every night. And so rather than I would have to give up my job and go to full-time day school for the senior year, and I didn't want to burden my family with that because it was not cheap. It was cheap, but it wasn't that cheap.
Right.
I mean, it was much less expensive, sort of. In those days than it is now. I mean, it's like $40,000-$50,000 a year tuition
right.
in some of the school.
Right.
So I mean, it was I think it was $600 a term, and there were 4 terms in a year, and you could take as many credits as you want. And so that's what I did, and so I decided to get a job. I turned in a resume to the Department of Employment in Hollywood after I banged on most doors, only to get the old catch-22, you're not in the union, we can't hire you. And then I go to the union, and they say, well, you can't get in the union until you have a job for 30 days. So it's like, so anyway, Joe Westheimer, who had a company who did titles and opticals and special effects for commercials, and TV shows and some feature work. Anyway, he called me. He got my resume, and he called me, and I wanted to talk to him for. I think I basically had the job in the first 20 minutes.
Oh wow!
And so basically, we hit it off really well, and I was kind of like his man Friday because I could do anything.
Right.
I mean, I was actually a lettering artist. I could do main title lettering. Do title. I could do alphabet design and things like that. In fact, I actually designed the Star Trek alphabet that they still use. That
oh
kind
wow!
of angular. Yeah,
that is
I
awesome.
never got any extra money for that, but I did a whole alphabet for a phototype set, and we used to phototype set it. And so anyway, I did hand lettered titles, set up the titles. There was a printer across the street that would do these white letters on black hot press for the main, for like all of the credits with lots of copy. I would just do the main title. But anyway, so I did all the title art, and then I shot the titles, and then I also was I was the resident crew. In other words, I was the grip, the gaffer, the operator, the camera operator, loader, sweep up, take film to the lab. I had, it was like I could do just about anything. And so I spent about 4 years with Joe, and then I started listening to Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix, and so my hair started growing. So I became a hippie. And this was in '67.
Right.
So I was basically working with Joe from '63 to '67, and so then I became a rock and roll photographer, and that's a long story there too. I mean, I basically shot a session with my friend, my high school buddy, who was working with a group that were playing on the Princess Louise, which was a coastal schooner that went up and down the coast, and it had been decommissioned some years back, and they converted it into a nightclub, and so it was kind of like and it was really neat. I mean, he said, come down and we can shoot on the ship. And I thought, it's great. I had one camera and one lens, and I shot 12 or so poses of the group all day. And my proof sheets wound up on the desk of their agent, who happened to be sharing the office with the guy that was producing actually was the producer of The Fifth Dimension, which was they were a hot group at the time, up and away. Anyway, so he said he saw these proofs sitting on his desk, and he picked them up and he started looking at them, and he says, "Who is this guy? I want him to shoot my group." So my second gig was to fly to Vegas and shoot an album cover of The Fifth Dimension.
Wow!
And so I had to acquire another camera and like 4 lenses. It kind of tapped out my reserves at the time. But anyway, that was successful, and through the producer of The Fifth, he turned me on to the various other groups, and so I did album covers and publicity stills and posters and things like that. So that was about, what was about late 68, 67, 68, 69, 70. About 3 years I was a rock photographer. And in those days, I mean, I could, it was pretty cheap to be a hippie. I mean, I basically got $150 for a photo session and like $250 to $750 for an album cover, depending on how famous the group was.
Right.
And so anyhow, then I'm actually writing my memoir, so I don't want to get into too much detail right now. But anyway,
right.
Anyhow, I lived up in San Francisco for a year, drove cable cars, worked on experimental films with a few artists that I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they were just interesting, weird movies that we were experimenting ideas with. Anyway, then I spent about a year. While I was doing the Fifth Dimension thing, I bought a guitar, and I came across a little guitar amp that was about the size of a Marlboro pack at this electronics store, and I thought, great, I can make a practice amp for my guitar. And so I bought the amp, and I bought a speaker that looked pretty good, and a pot, and a battery pack. It was a 9-volt battery pack. And so I put it in an English leather box, and this was a great amp. And it was about as simple as you could get. I mean, it's just one knob to turn it on and control the volume. You could get Jimi Hendrix level feedback from it, I mean, if you wanted. I mean, it was a very interesting found invention. Anyway, years after I went to San Francisco, I spent a year up there in my sabbatical, kind of. And then my friend in LA called me up and said, Richard, get down here. Jimmy Guercio's going to fund Pig Nose Industries. So this was the Pig Nose amp. If you're a guitar player, you'll know about it. But anyway, it was the first portable guitar amp. And I spent about a year doing that. And I did setting up the company, and we had a production line. And I went from there to, am I answering your question, by the way?
Oh, yeah. This is great.
Yeah. So anyway, I then, let's see. So after about a year, I got bored with the amplifier business. I mean, it was a resounding success. Every guitar player had one.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, I built 65 of them personally. And then that was before I moved up to San Francisco. And before I left the business, Wayne and I got these amps to all of the top guitar players. We got them to Keith Richards, we got them to George Harrison, Terry Kath in Chicago, Frank Zappa. I mean, I could Van Morrison. I mean, I could go on and on. Right. We just gave them away to these top guitarists to, spread the word about the Pig Nose. We wanted to try to get funding to build them on a production level.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went up to San Francisco, spent a year up there, and then Wayne called me back and said, come on down here because Jimmy's going to fund it. And so so then I spent a year. We had a production line out in Calabasas. With 4 women and a hippie who was the quality control guy. He was pretty much stoned all day, but he would actually test all of the amps to make sure that they were up to snuff.
Right.
And I think we built. I think we made 30,000 amplifiers in the first year, and they were just selling like hotcakes. Martin Guitar was actually selling it for us. They had all of the music stores in America were selling Martin guitars, so they were our representative and sales agents. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so at the end of this year, I decided that's enough. I want to get back behind the camera. And so I started shooting time-lapse clouds for Bob Abel. It was for something. It was for the upcoming bicentennial.
Right.
And so I did a couple of pretty amazing cloud sessions where we went up to Mount Shasta for one shoot, went out near Salt Lake City for another one. Anyway, I started shooting various other things. I got some other phone. I'm not going to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, sorry. So anyway, we did. Then I started doing experimental photography, basically motion controlled animation, and built special cameras on tracks, and it's like a horizontal animation stand with and we did some pretty amazing commercials with my friend Richard Taylor and Wayne Kimball and I. We all kind of came into Abel's and got Clios for Bob Abel one after another for all of these commercials we did. Mm-hmm. Like the 7-Up Bubbles commercial was like a big famous one. And then that spun off into the Uncola campaign, 7-Up. And let me see, then we did all the station breaks for ABC with streak photography and slit scan. And we have built these sort of there was kind of robotic cameras that would do repeat passes one after another. Mm-hmm. These shots were like 30, 40, 50 passes on the same shot, adding elements one at a time. And it would take like 10, 12 hours to shoot 30 frames for a commercial.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was what I call photomasochism. And so anyway, one day, I got a phone call from John Dykstra, and the thing is, John was an experimental photographer and had been working with Doug Trumbull on some projects, and so I knew of John, and I knew what he'd been doing, and I saw some of his work, and he did the same thing with him. He knew of me, didn't know me, but knew of my work, and so he called me one day and said, "Hey, Richard, I heard you're a pretty good cameraman. Would you like to come out here and talk about shooting this sci-fi project for 20th Century Fox called Star Wars?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll be right there." And so I jumped in my car, drove out to the Valley, met with John and Gary Kurtz, who was there, who was the producer of the show. And again, about half hour, I had the job. And so I was the first camera on Star Wars and on the visual effects for Star Wars. And then so that was a pretty good project. So
oh yeah.
Since I've been doing all the talking, if you got any questions, I mean, this is where it all started. Basically.
Right.
I mean, Star Wars was my first major feature that I ever got any kind of credit for, and I wound up getting an Oscar for it. And then I went on to do Empire and Jedi and Poltergeist.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, I mean,
of course, Raiders and Lost Ark.
Right.
When I was at ILM for about 8 years, and then I left to set up Boston.
Right.
Boston.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, you're instrumental in so many of my favorite movies, and it's really cool that I'm able to talk to you about all this stuff. And I mean, you hit on a lot of the first like 3 questions I was going to ask you, but one name I was going to mention that was sort of instrumental in your photography and ultimately your film career is your high school teacher, Wesley Walker. Now,
oh yeah, how did you hear about them? He was great.
yeah,
It's interesting that I'm a generalist, right? I mean, when I joined the Navy, I had this fantastic educational moment in Norman, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
There was a Navy base in Norman, Oklahoma, which was a naval air base, and so they had a prep school that was set up there. And in the school, we went from polynomials to calculus in 6 weeks, and we had to learn all the laws of physics and all of the. We had to learn how to type 25 words a minute without making a mistake. So when was I? So yeah, so this 6 weeks that I spent in Norman, Oklahoma, was one of the most amazing educational experiences I ever had. I mean, this is before I went to SC, mm-hmm. But and before that, in high school, I had the opportunity to take photography a couple of years in my junior and senior year in high school. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was all 3 years anyway. But I was an annual staff photographer, and I was shooting sports. I was shooting sports events for the LA Examiner. They had a foundation called the Scholastic Sports Association, which the LA Examiner was like there were 3 papers in LA in those days. It was the Mirror, the Times, and the Examiner, and so actually I bought a 4x5 camera from a friend of mine when I was in 9th grade, and I got the camera and an enlarger, developing trays, a whole bunch of photographic equipment for $25.
Oh wow!
And the camera. But anyway, so then I started taking photography from Wesley, from Mr. Walker, and he also taught physics. He was like a super nerd. He taught physics, and he taught the physics of photography to us.
Yeah.
There were maybe 15 of us in the class, 15, maybe 20. Mm. And we had to mix up our own developer and find out what all the different aspects of the different compounds that made up the developer for black and white film.
Right.
And then I learned how to make prints, and I became pretty good at photography in those 3 years. And by the time I got into the Navy, I was like sailing through the Naval Photographic School. I joined under a particular program where they had to guarantee my rate. In other words, if I wanted to be a photographer's mate, they had to send me to photographic school.
Right.
If my grades on my they gave a battery of tests, like an IQ test and arithmetic test and mechanical test and sonar test, and so we had to take all these tests and when I was in boot camp. But that's later. So anyway, Mr. Walker was like a pivotal character. And the thing is that I don't have, even though I've done I've designed a lot of equipment and have a pretty good knack. I have a machine shop in the basement, for example. So I'm a kind of closet machinist, but I hired exquisite machinists and design engineers, to build the kind of equipment that we had to make Star Wars.
Right. And
but
yeah, so
but the thing is that the extent of my education were like mechanical drawing in 8th grade in Minneapolis. You know, before we moved to California, I grew up in Fargo. You know, until I was about 10 or 11, and then we moved to Minneapolis for a couple of years, and then came to California. But anyway, so I had in junior high school, I had print shop, electric shop, wood shop, and they had engineering drawing, and so I learned how to draw, and I was, but one of my uncles was an architect, and I always thought that maybe I would be an architect until I got into photography. But anyway, that's so I trail on.
No, you're good. So you get that call from John Dykstra, and then lo and behold, you're working on what is now probably the biggest movie, and that changed the world basically. And you were there and you were there with those original guys, you know, John Dykstra, Phil Tippett, Lauren Peterson, that all were so instrumental in creating that world and creating all those really fantastic special effects and creatures and all that stuff. And what was it like for you to be a part of that film that had those groundbreaking visual effects and would make that company a legendary company, you know, 40 years later?
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is that you know, John and I kind of learned a lot about how to create a team. Mm-hmm. And before that, I was kind of a one-man band. I mean, I could do everything myself. When I was a photographer, I shot I got the job, went on and met the people, got the job, picked the location, shot the pictures, developed the film, made the prints, and all that. I did it all myself. Right. And once in a while, if I had to have dye transfer color prints made, I had a really good dye transfer lab that could make prints. And then I had this incredible retouch artist that used to do all the retouching for the Playboy magazine. And so I did assemble kind of like a small team. And then I got together with Wayne Kimball, who was a graphic designer. And so working with Wayne, as you know, in terms of the design concept for album covers and things like that.
Yeah.
So I was pretty lucky to be in the right place at the right time with the right chops, as I say. In other words, I knew what I could do, and the thing is that we were really able to assemble a great team. I mean, I resurrected the blue screen process, for example. In other words, I had done tests with Joe Westheimer on blue screen in the late 60s, or the mid-60s. And I figured that was the best way to do these shots. So I had an argument with John, who wanted to do front light, backlight match system. And I said, that's not going to work because the match move, the blurred edges of the match won't match the color, you know, the color shot.
Right.
So by using the blue screen process, we extract the maps from the image itself, and we had to maintain that blur, and actually on Star Wars it was much easier to. So anyway, we built a great big blue screen, and Al Miller, who was our electronic genius that John had met, he had actually started out as a nuclear physicist up in Lawrence, Livermore, up in the Bay Area. And John met him on some project and talked him into building this motion control system. And the thing is that both John and I recognized that that the only way to do this movie that George wanted to make was to be able to shoot models with a camera that moved and the models moved. So that basically when the model came past the camera quickly, for example, on a swish pan, there would be blurred edges. And if the edges didn't blur, they wouldn't look right. They would stutter.
Right.
Which was the problem with stop motion animation forever, until Jurassic Park. Anyway, so we realized that we had to build a system that had camera, pan, tilt, roll, axis on the nodal point of the lens, and I designed the head. I pretty much was the architect of the photographic system. And I was working, Don Trumbull, who's Doug's father, was a fantastic guy. And basically what I would do is I would talk to Don. I'd say, look, here's what we need to do. We need to build this moviola, for instance.
Right.
And we got we had a Technorama camera that was extra. So we had an extra 8-perf camera, and I took the movement out of that camera and built a VistaVision moviola out of it. And I said, look, here's the concept. We have the lamp house here, the movement, and a mirror, and a field chart. And I would design the concept, on a little 4x5 pad. And I could draw pretty well. And so I could draw the concept in pretty much kind of like, not in scale, but in perspective, so everything looked probably the right way. And then we'd talk over the details of it. And then, like, the next day he'd show up, or the next day or two, he would show up with engineering drawings. And then we would go over those, make the last minute changes, and then some of the parts were made out of house for some of the stuff. I mean, even though we had our own machine shop as well. So at ILM there was a machine shop, an electronics shop, animation, rotoscope, the optical department. I mean, the optical department, for example, Robbie Blaylock was a very talented guy, young guy who was actually studying film arts at Cal Arts, California Institute of the Arts. And so he basically taught Larry Butler, who designed the motion. He designed an optical printer for Marooned in Space for Columbia many years earlier, or some years earlier.
Yeah.
And so the printer that he had built became obsolete at Columbia, and so basically they gave it to Cal Arts. Somehow Robbie was able to buy it from the school, because it was 35 and the school wasn't able to do 35 millimeter. Everything was at 16. So he had this printer that needed to be completely rebuilt. And he'd never done a blue screen shot before. He didn't even know what key numbers were, that's the numbers that are on every photo film.
Right.
Anyway, I talked to Billy Reinhold, who was the optical printer operator at Westheimer Company, and I talked him into coming out and teaching Robbie how to do a blue screen shot. And so that's how Robbie wound up learning how to do that. Because, whenever I could find somebody who knew how to do it already, we would, why have to reinvent the wheel?
Right.
So I did know and interviewed a lot of the people from the old effects departments that had been closed. The studio closed the effects departments down in like the mid to late 50s. And so there was no visual effects movies made with the exception of 2010, 2001 and Harryhausen's, and a couple of funky movies.
Right.
But basically, after about 1953 or 1955 or something like that, there weren't any visual effects movies made. So everything was retired. And that's how I was able to buy the optical printer, the VistaVision optical printer from Howard Anderson, who was at Paramount Studios. And so the VistaVision equipment that they had in the labs there were last used on the Ten Commandments. And in fact, we went into this room to look at this printer that Howard said that he would sell. I think we paid $17,000 for the printer. And we got 2 or 3 rotoscope benches, huge contraptions that had Bell and Howell cameras, VistaVision cameras on them, and a bunch of movements. I mean, it was just an incredible amount of equipment that we bought from him that he had no use for because it was a dead format.
Right.
But it was the perfect format to resurrect the Star Wars because it was double the size of the image, and so we could basically do composites and reduction, and so they wouldn't look dupy.
Right.
If you just did a duplication of 35 to 35, it looked milky and dupy, and so by having this larger format, that was kind of the key to the quality of Star Wars.
And, I've read and watched a lot of interviews with George and, other folks that were working on the movie at the time. And the production didn't go smoothly. There were a lot of, whether it be some effect shots were coming in slowly or issues with the script, whatever the issues were at the time. How were you and the crew at ILM sort of handling those challenges as you guys were shooting those effects?
Well, first of all, it was a matter of talking George into shooting anamorphic. Because he wanted to shoot the movie in 185. I mean, George was not into image quality so much. He was a storyteller.
Right.
And in fact, American Graffiti was shot in Techniscope, which was like 2x35. So you got a widescreen format, but only 2x, so it was half the amount of film it would be if it was Panavision. So anyway, we talked George into shooting an anamorphic, and that meant that we had to get an anamorphic printer lens, and I went out to Panavision, and George Kramer was the old optical guy at the time, and so he had an optical lens that had been made for some project years ago that kind of was close to what we wanted to do. We put like I think we wanted to use a 2 diopter lens added onto one end of the lens to make it transfer 35 millimeter anamorphic or transfer VistaVision size image to 35 anamorphic for the composite camera. And so that was Robbie's printer. And then we had another printer that had been built for the Ten Commandments, which was this monster. It was upstairs. I don't know how the hell they got it out of it. I mean, we went upstairs in the stage, and it was like about maybe 2 or 3 stories, about 3 stories up to get to this room. It was built off of the stage. It was part of the sound stage.
Right.
And there was a hallway there, and a door leading into it. There was no dust there. I mean, basically, nobody's been there since the Ten Commandments. Basically, we walked into the room that the printer was in, turned the switch on, which was like a knob. It was a twist knob switch. and turned the light on, and the last camera report that had been turned for the last shot that was done for 10 Commandments was still sitting on the write-up desk. I mean, they basically finished the last shot, walked out of the room, and closed the door, and that was it. So it had been sitting there for like, since this was the 10 Commandments was when?
Ooh.
53 or 54 or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Anyway, it had been closed for like 15 years or something, maybe 20. And so we got that printer, and I had to have David Grafton build a lens for it. And I mean, it was a pretty interesting project. I mean, and we had to take all this kind of semi-surplus distribution equipment and turn it into what turn it into machinery that would produce the kind of quality that we wanted to have on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were able to do that. And the thing that's interesting is that Star Wars was done with somewhere between 75 and 90 people, not always at the same time, but I mean, there was like a crew of about 50, maybe 55 that were at the ILM facility in the valley,
right,
that were there for the whole project. And so we had 2 years, 75 to 90 people or something like that, and $2.5 million. And we produced all the 365 shots for Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. And
the thing is, backing up to the early days of Star Wars, because it took 9 months for us to finish building the system. In other words, we didn't shoot anything for 9 months. We were building the contraption that had to work. And it took 9 months to do that. And I remember Jim Nelson saying, you bozos have spent $1 million and we haven't got a single frame of film yet. And actually, I shot the first shot that we did was not a composite shot. I shot it with my Mitchell, my high-speed Mitchell that I bought when I was at Abel's, and with a CinemaScope lens, an old CinemaScope lens, and it was the escape pod from when the droids escape from
right.
And that shot, we put like sparkle tones, sparklies. I mean, what was it? The little tiny bits of mylar around the edge of the thing, and then let it go, and then with an air shooting air in there to cause the sparkly effect for the shot. And there was so much sparkly there, you didn't notice the fact that there was no star field. Oh. And so, I mean, the shot was on the screen for maybe 40 frames, a little over a minute, a little over a second.
Right.
But you got the point. And that's, interestingly, that's how a lot of the shots in Star Wars were very, very, very quick.
Yeah.
I mean, the one shot, for example, when Lucas has to shoot has to drop the bomb into the hole.
Right.
That shot was like 20 frames long.
Oh,
it was less than a second.
Yeah.
But it's like, you don't need more than that. In other words, you don't want to labor the shot.
Right.
I mean, you want to make the point.
Right. And
one of those shots that for example, the star streak and disappear shot where they go into hyperspace.
Yeah.
I shot that as a test. I mean, you know what? I think I have an idea of how to do the shot. So I basically went over to the star field and I came up with a streak program and shot maybe 20, I think it was 24 or 30 frames long.
Mm-hmm.
And sent it to George, and he said, "Crow, that's great." He cuts it in. And so that was one of the easiest shots. It took me about an hour and a half to shoot that.
Oh, wow.
And then that shot then cuts to a shot of the Millennium Falcon disappearing very quickly into infinity. And the way I did that one was because the problem I had somewhat was the fact that I had only a 40-foot track, and I could only get the model so small in 40 feet, even with a super wide-angle lens. So I basically shot. I took my 4x5 camera and I shot a 4x5 Polaroid of the a color Polaroid of the back end of the Millennium Falcon. Cut it out, put it on a piece of glass, and shot it. And that was another shot that took maybe 30 frames. And it gets one of the biggest reactions from the audience because it was like the trigger. It was the dynamic trigger of the moment, you know.
Right.
And so that's, you know, those lessons we learned, and there were many along the way. But somehow we were able to do it.
Yeah.
And it all looked really great.
Yeah.
You know, backing up, I mean, I was worried when I first started on the show. I thought, well, you know, the script is kind of it's kind of like a teenage script, you know.
Yeah.
And I was worried about those lines like "Trust in the Force, Luke."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I thought, you know, who's going to make those lines play? You know, Brando.
Right.
You know, and then George was forced to shoot the movie in England, which he hated.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, it was such a great. Oh God, the British film industry was chomping at the bit, you know, to help us on this.
Mm-hmm.
And all those great actors and plasters and set builders, and it was fantastic. John Barry was the production designer, and then he horribly had an aneurysm or something like that in the brain. One day he had a terrible headache, and he said, you know, I have to go home. I can't. And he went home, and they took him to the hospital, and he died.
Oh, God, that's awful.
He just automatically, just suddenly. And so all of a sudden, Norman Reynolds then was the art director. And Norman had to step up and become the production designer. And he did so in spades. I mean, George, yeah. So Norman was a fantastic production designer. Anyway, so I'm worried a little bit about the script because of those lines, you know. And one day I heard Jim Nelson, who's the production manager, and he was the one that was kind of handling the money and all that kind of stuff for ILM, announced over the loudspeaker that George had just cast Alec Guinness to play Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I thought, hallelujah, this is going to be a blockbuster.
Yeah.
You know, that solidified it for me, and I had all the faith in the project that it would be a monster movie, and it was.
Right. And you know, once the film comes out and it's fully edited with the completion of, you know, all the effects and the score and all that stuff, I mean, what was your reaction? Like, could you believe that you guys worked on that film, that you got all those shots to look the way that they finally looked?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I was amazed. And the thing is, the reel that we had at ILM, there was a 1,000-foot reel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, what we did, I think we did 14 minutes of film, so it was a little over 1 reel long finals
Right.
that we had. And so basically, as the shots were composited, in whatever order that was, they were completely out of order. I mean, for example, the opening shot was like one of the last shots I did.
Oh, really?
And the Star Destroyer coming over the camera.
Right.
And I thought I used to lose sleep over this because George would come by and say, "Well, let's build this model on the side of the of the wall here," and he'd go on and on about how this model could be, you know. And I said, "But George, we only have a 40-foot track, you know." And so I decided I was going to do a test. And we had a one Star Destroyer that was finished on the bottom and on one side.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we shot it from right to left, we'd shoot it normally, and if it had to go from left to right, we'd flop it. You know, and since there was no discerning graphics or anything like that would give it away, that was what the plan was. And I said, I gave it to Grant. I said, Grant, put your best guy on tricking the bottom of the thing out as best you can.
Yeah.
And I'm going to shoot a test, and then make a little blockade runner that's about 3 inches long, and I'll stick it on a paper clip. You know, I'll straighten out a paper clip and stick it on the front of the ship, and I'll just do a test, and let's see how that works.
Right.
And so he did that. I did a test, and the next day we were just flummoxed about how great it looked.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing is that the camera was like, it literally the lens was scraping the surface of the model. It was so close. And
wow.
I could tilt the lens so I could hold focus from one end of the model to the next. And so basically, I was still shooting at f/22, so I could hold focus on that model being so close as it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the shot was George's elated.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, every time I talk to my dad, I'm like, because he was there opening day in 1977 to watch Star Wars. I think he was around 12 years old. And I always ask him, you know, what was that experience like? And that first shot is the one that he always mentions. Nobody had seen anything like that before.
Well, the thing is, I realized that, and I said to myself, this is the most important shot that we're going to do.
Yeah.
Because if the audience doesn't buy this shot, we're in deep trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it is a classic shot, and everybody loves it.
Yeah.
So that was great.
And, you know, one of the sequences...
So we had
I was going to say, one of the other sequences that I just learned in reading editor Paul Hirsch's book was that was going to be cut out was the Death Star battle. That the studio apparently wanted that out, saying, oh, well, you guys already rescued the princess. There's no need for all this extra stuff, which baffled me when I read that.
Oh, yeah, really?
Yeah. So,
well, the studio, they were baffled in more ways than one. I mean, the thing is, one of the famous stories about and the thing is that Island was got this moniker of being the country club,
right?
You know, because it went on and on and on. First of all, it took us so long to build the system up to where we knew that we could do the work with it.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent Lynn Dunn out. Linwood Dunn was sort of like the dean of special effects. He'd done It's a Mad, Mad World.
Right.
You know, and West Side Story and some of these great pictures. And Billy Reinhold, the guy that I hired to teach Robbie how to build a screenshot, did all the composites on that. So anyway, Lynn Dunn came out with Cecil Love, And Cecil Ludd was his machinist. He was like the Dickerson that did all the work for Edison.
Right.
And he was about 5 feet tall and weighed about 90 pounds, but he was smart as a whip. And so Lynn and Cecil came out to check us out, and Lynn, of course, Dexter is like is a real evangelist. He's going on and on about the system and pointing to this and pointing to that. He opens up the back of the electronics thing, and it's this massive wires, because it was all hardwired. We didn't have many circuit boards, so it was all hard. I mean, there was pretty simple circuit board. Anyway, and John would go on and on, and Cecil was like this real stoic character, and John would finish his diatribe, and then he'd look to Cecil and he'd be like, what do you think of that? and Cecil would just take his head and look off the other direction. He wasn't going to betray himself with any answer. It was really funny.
Oh, that's great.
But anyway, Lynn took me aside. He said, Richard, he says, you know what? He says, this is a beautiful system you put together. He says, but you know what? Scheduling the work is going to be a real project. You got to make sure that you get somebody that's really good at scheduling the work and making sure you get it all done in time. Because it's like 365 shots, but each shot had multiple elements in it. So, each shot would have an average of 3 or 4 elements. So, you'd have, a couple thousand elements. And plus, you're adding rotoscope work and all this. I mean, it was just a massive amount of work that you got.
Right.
And the roto artists were all potheads. They'd be shooting frame by frame of roto, and their eyes were pink.
Oh my gosh!
They used to sneak up on the roof and smoke a joint.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Anyway.
Yeah. So Star Wars comes out, and then pretty much as it's premiering, George is already thinking about Empire Strikes Back, putting all his money into the sequel and saying, if this doesn't work, it's finished. And having that, sense of always betting on himself. And we know with this being the 40th anniversary now of Empire Strikes Back, I wanted to ask you, did you guys try to raise the bar, saying, okay, we did all these groundbreaking effects in Star Wars, but how are we going to do it even better in Empire Strikes Back?
Well, you know what? That's another. I don't know how long we've been going on with this. We've been going on with this for, an hour?
Yeah, about an hour now, yeah.
Empire is another hour.
Right.
Because Empire was, first of all, it was going to be the battle, the snow battle was going to happen, on this snowy terrain with blue sky and fluffy clouds, and there couldn't be a matte line.
Hey.
If there was a matte line in any shot, it would have killed the sequence. Mm-hmm. So we had to solve the matte line, and that was really difficult in the photochemical days. But we did it. So, but that might be another episode.
Yeah. That's so true. It's funny. I had Phil Tippett.
Because I could do we could do another another piece on Empire and Jedi.
Oh yeah, I would love that.
So why don't you call Shelley and have her set up another time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got nothing going on with all this coronavirus stuff, so.
Yeah, right.
So Richard, before I let you go here, and I would love to schedule another interview with you to talk about Empire and Jedi. So before I let you go, one last question. When you look back on Star Wars, what is the one thing that you're most proud of with that film?
Well, I mean, in a sense, actually completing the job.
Yeah.
was, and we did so in spades. I mean, but I think maybe the thing, the one shot that I'm most proud of is the opening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as I said, that was the most important. I considered that the most important shot because it had to really work in order to lasso the audience.
Right. Yeah, and ultimately that shot would be, one of the most iconic shots in the history of cinema. So thank you very much for that, because it's honestly.
Well, there's four tipping points.
Yes, I was actually going to mention that to you.
Star Wars. I mean, I think the first one is Ralph McQuarrie.
Right.
I mean, Ralph McQuarrie's paintings were what George was able to sell the project with, and I mean. I felt bad for Ralph because Ralph was like, he was such a pivotal character in the movie, and if George hadn't found him, it probably never would have been made.
Right.
So anyway, first was Ralph. Second was us putting together the visual effects because I don't think there was another team at the time that could have done that. There just wasn't anyone available. There was no infrastructure, and we were it. And we had to invent our way out of the corner. We paint ourselves in the corner, and we had to invent our way out of that daily. And so everybody had to put their best ideas forward on the project and did so. So we were the Ralph McQuarrie, the visual effects team. John Williams.
Yep.
Music. And what was the other one? Oh,
I think the other one was Alec Guinness.
That's right, Alec Guinness. Thank you.
Yep.
Alec Guinness was such an important cast, and basically what Alec Guinness did was elevate the movie out of the teenage era. In other words, the teenage demographic was where it was headed until Alec Guinness came about, because that meant that the senior citizens could go and watch the movie and get caught up in it.
Right.
Because he had the gravitas to pull that roll out.
Yeah, and now it's.
So there's Ben Bird, of course, is another one.
Mm-hmm.
There's others, but anyway.
Yeah, without those four, it's who knows if it all works. Yeah, and ultimately, it created the most popular saga and franchise probably ever.
It's like a religion.
Yeah.
You go to the Space Con, and it's like they had one here a few years ago. Maybe it was the 35th or the 30th. I don't remember. Maybe it was even the 40th. Anyway. At the convention center in LA here, they have they have the north building and the south building. Well, the one building is filled with all of us guys who are telling lies about what we did on the show.
Uh-huh.
The panels and everything. And then the other one was like merchandising. There was like 7 or 8 versions of the laser sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's like pajamas, bedspreads, action figures, galore. It was just incredible. The whole facility was filled with merchandise, and George made $1 billion at least.
Yeah.
more than $1 billion.
Yeah, he truly created an empire with Star Wars, and it changed the world. It changed the world.
But you know what? When Marsha left on Jedi,
yeah,
the heart went out. Heart went out of Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reading Brian J. Jones's autobiography on George. I think it's called George Lucas: A Life, and he goes in detail about stuff going on with George and Marcia during in the early '80s, just having a lot of problems, and then once they got that divorce, it showed in Temple of Doom, the darkness of that movie, and ultimately, once they split,
those movies were so heartless.
Yeah.
The thing is, I couldn't get involved. So the second one was the second one they did with the digital camera, that kind of funky hybrid.
I think for the Indiana Jones movies.
No, I'm talking for Star Wars.
Oh, for Star Wars. Yeah, I think you're right.
And I was about 20 or 30 minutes into it. I said, "What is this a movie about? I can't figure it out."
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well,
they were not well loved by the Star Wars aficionados.
Right. Well, Richard, I really want to thank you for coming on today, and we'll definitely get the Empire and Jedi episodes scheduled soon. But thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Let us know when we can see them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right. You have a great day, Richard.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.